all things came to be through the Word. And there is John explaining how the universe came to exist. It is word-based. It was spoken by God, who is the Word.
There was no matter to do the causing, so no materialistic explanation is going to be sufficient for the origin of the material universe. You need to look for something immaterial that's nevertheless powerful, and that's the God hypothesis.
One of the things that was so important to me as a brand new believer was to be able to reconcile seemingly opposing ideas or disciplines like math and science, which I've always loved in school, and then this idea of faith and believing in things like a virgin giving birth and the resurrection of a man from the dead. And listening and learning from people like you has been so helpful to me. So here you are at Oxford, and you're debating notable atheists, you're teaching on math and on science, and yet you are a man of faith, debating people like Christopher Hitchens, who's wonderful to listen to, and Richard Dawkins, who's challenging to so many of us. Have you always had a love for math and science, or is that something that developed later in your life?
No, it developed very early on. I was quite good at arithmetic at school, and that then led to an interest in mathematics. It also led to an interest in languages. I love languages, and I've kept that going. But right early on, my parents, who were wonderful in encouraging me to think about the big questions. So I wanted to know where mathematics fitted in science and where science fitted into the big picture. And I was a teenager at the time when I discovered that it was quite clear that science didn't give us the full picture. It can't explain everything. And I started voraciously reading and thinking and studying, and particularly C.S. Lewis, who I lived to hear in 1962 in his last lectures, was a tremendous help to me in showing how logical Christianity was, just as logical as the mathematics that I loved.
For some people, studying mathematics is worse than eating broccoli. And yet you say that you love to study math. What is it about mathematics that's interesting?
Well, I love broccoli too. I think the fascination is you here have a very highly compressed language. And we discover that in some mysterious almost way that it tells us something about the universe. We can reduce some of the things going on out there in the universe to mathematics. And we think of Isaac Newton and his gravitational equation, or Kepler's laws, or the Clerk Maxwell's laws of electromagnetism. And that always fascinated me, that in a few symbols you could capture something which, when you unfolded it, gave you, for instance, if you take Newton's equation, gravitation equation, you can very rapidly see that the planets move in ellipses round the sun as focus. And that kind of thing absolutely riveted me. Of course, it all depends, I think, at school time of having a really inspirational teacher, which I was very fortunate to have. So I love mathematics. But you see, the fascinating thing is, Einstein once said, the only incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. And he put his finger on something very important. And that's one of the reasons I'm a Christian, because mathematics works. And atheism gives me no explanation of why mathematics works. But the great scientists, Newton I've named, Kepler, Galileo, Clerk Maxwell, Faraday, all of them were believers in God. And I think the best way to sum that up is in the words of C.S. Lewis. He once said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature because they believed in the lawgiver. So there's an intimate connection with the biblical worldview and the rise of modern science. I often say to people, Kurt, that I'm not remotely ashamed of being a scientist and a believer in God, because arguably Christianity gave me my subject.
I love that. And you mentioned earlier that your parents encouraged you to read on a wide variety of subjects and from a variety of authors, not just a Christian worldview, but others as well. Do you recommend that for parents today? Because there's certainly things that they could be reading that would undermine a biblical worldview.
We need, as parents, particularly Christian parents, to prepare our children for going out into college and university. And I know the statistics in some countries are horrifying, that over 70% of kids who profess Christianity at school, within 2 or 3 years of university, they've lost it. And I think one of the main reasons for that is that the parents are not spending time answering their questions, or if they can't answer them, which is often the case, feeding them with really good information, which is available today in a measure that it wasn't available when I was younger, and helping them to think through these worldview issues. You cannot live in a pluralistic, complex, multicultural world and stand as a Christian without facing questions. And you need to be ready to answer them and defend the Christian gospel. And that's what I try to spend most of my life doing.
You mentioned that you had a chance to actually sit in some of the classrooms or the lectures, hear lectures from C.S. Lewis. What a privilege that must have been. How did your sitting at his feet influence the career path that you've taken?
Well, I went to the last of his lectures in 1962 in Cambridge, not knowing that he was seriously ill. He died the following year, as you will recall. But he'd begun to influence me long before I reached Cambridge in 1962, because my father gave me a copy of Mere Christianity, and it was like standing under a fire hose of logical thinking, and it just opened my mind, and I devoured every word. And what was most important for me was I have no idea what it's like to be an adult and not a believer in God. And I needed someone to guide me into what that was like. And so C.S. Lewis, who was an atheist until middle life, until his 30s certainly, provided that guide and helped me to understand the nuts and bolts of atheism. And I didn't know that one day I would confront the leading atheists of the day, like Richard Dawkins and so on. And all of that was enormously helpful, because what got really into my heart at an early stage was that Christianity was true. I'd seen it lived, really lived in the lives of my parents, and they loved me enough not to force it down my throat, and they encouraged me to think, so that I was persuaded inwardly of the truth of Christianity. So when I left Ireland, with all its religion and its factions and everything else and bigotry, and got to Cambridge, I didn't lose my faith in God, as many of my contemporaries did, because they had never imbibed it. They'd never believed it for themselves in an individual way. So parents were very important. Lewis was important. And other people were important in helping me to think about scripture as hard as I do about my maths.
As a mathematician, John, when you look at the universe, what are some of the evidences that point you to believe that it was created by God?
Well, the very first thing, it might surprise some people, it's the very fact that we can do science with mathematics. In other words, we discovered that this is what I call a word-based universe. It's describable in a language. And that resonates wonderfully with two things, two central statements in the biblical text. Firstly, the first words of the Gospel of John: in the beginning was the Word. The Word was God. And then a bit later on, all things came to be through the Word. And there is John explaining how the universe came to exist. It is word-based. It was spoken by God, who is the Word. And in the simpler language of Genesis, but no less profound, you have the constant repetition, and God said, and God said. So one of the things that points me towards God is the semiotic nature of mathematics. It describes the universe in language. And another thing that fits beautifully in with that was discovered relatively recently, and that is the fact that the human genome is the longest word, contains the longest word we've ever discovered, 3.4 billion chemical letters all arranged in a row. And when Francis Collins stood beside the President of the United States and announced that they decoded it, they said, this is the language of God. And there in our genetics, in every one of the 10 trillion cells in our bodies, is a lengthy word. And that, to my mind, speaks directly of an intelligent input from a speaking God. It's a word-based universe. So that's where I would start. And then I would pick up probably from physics the fact that's recognized by virtually all physicists and cosmologists that this universe is incredibly fine-tuned to have carbon-based life on it. The basic constants of nature are so precise, have to be so precise, otherwise the universe wouldn't exist. And again, that demands explanation. Every scientist sees that it demands an explanation. But people like the late Stephen Hawking, who was a genius and was in Cambridge around the same time as I was there, they reject, of course, the God explanation, but they come to believe in a universe that created itself from nothing, which to my mind is logically absurd apart from anything else.
John, I'm so glad you're not recommending that people stay away from the tough questions, but you are inviting them into those difficult questions and to explore those things. And that's what I want for my children. And I love that you see studying math almost as a form of worshiping God. Explain what you mean by that. We think of singing as worship or reading the scriptures, but studying mathematics, in what way does that send us into worship?
Well, not quite in the same way. I think if we're singing really good music, you're actually verbalizing things about God. And that is very important because, as I understand worship in its narrow sense at least, it is a response to God speaking. And it's our articulating what we think about God and believe about Him. Just to give you a crude analogy, if you want to get people to laugh, you have to tell them a joke. You don't discuss the mechanics of laughter. And if you want to get people to worship, you tell them about God. You don't discuss emotion or anything like that. And therefore, it seems to me the primary source of worship is God speaking to us through His Word. But mathematics and the study of nature in general, the heavens declare the glory of God, not only visually, but mathematically. And there's an absolute beauty in some of the mathematics that we study. And it certainly fits perfectly in with the idea that whatever we do, whether it's mathematics or expounding scripture, both of which I like doing, we do all to the glory of God. It's not restricted to what happens inside a church building.
I heard that you wrote a little book, and it's being read around the world, called Can Science Explain Everything? Why is everyone talking about this book so much?
It addresses a feeling that's very widespread, that science has been so successful. Look at the technology it has produced. Surely in the end, it will answer everything and push religion right out to the side, and especially any ideas of God. And I want to combat that. And I want to say that science is powerful. I love it, but it's limited. And it's easy to see that it's limited. There's a very brilliant Nobel Prize winner called Sir Peter Medawar, and he once said it's so easy to see that science is limited because it cannot even answer the questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going? And what is the meaning of life? And he hit on something very important there. The late Lord Sachs, who was the chief rabbi in the United Kingdom and Commonwealth, wrote a book once. He was a brilliant philosopher. And he said something roughly like this: science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts them together to see what they mean. And the point is that science can answer many questions, but it cannot answer the questions of meaning. We often put it this way: that science answers mainly the how questions and the why questions of function. Why is that bit there? But it cannot deal with the why questions of purpose. And I often illustrate this by telling a story about a fictitious Aunt Matilda who's baked a beautiful cake, and there it is in front of us. And she presents it to an assembly of all the Nobel Prize winners and asks them to analyze the cake. So you get a brilliant chemical analysis, you get an analysis in terms of biology and physics, in terms of quarks and electrons and everything else. And they give you a huge and perfect analysis. And when they've finished, she says, now, just before you go, please tell me why the cake was made. And she begins to grin. And the physicist, well, he could tell what it's made of, but he can't tell why she made the cake. And nor can the chemist, and nor can anybody else, not even the mathematicians who don't get Nobel Prizes. None of them can tell her why. Only she can if she reveals it to them. Now, this is a very simple analogy, but it's hugely important because it's the same with the universe. We can examine what it's made of and get brilliant scientific theories, but to understand why it was made and why we were made, God who created it will have to reveal it to us. Now, here's the important thing. When Aunt Matilda reveals it to us, we don't shut our reason off. We use our reason to understand her revelation. And just as we use our reason to understand science, how it works, we use our reason to understand her explanation of why she made it. And it's exactly the same, because so many people think that faith is a religious word. It means believing where there's no evidence. That's nonsense. Faith is an ordinary word. It means trust, and it's as important in science as it is in any other field. And that's why I say that we need to distinguish between these two explanations.
Why are people, do you think, so committed in the academic fields to not believing in God? And they've done a fantastic job of making us think that we're the ones who believe fantastical things. But really, it's the ones who deny God who appear to me to be living in this fantasy world that out of nothing, everything comes.
Sometimes when I'm talking to scientists, I'll say, what do you do science with? And they will talk about some expensive equipment, and I point to my head and I say this. Oh, they said, you mean and they're about to say mind when they know that it's not politically correct to believe in the mind. So they say your brain, you do science for your brain. I say, okay, I believe the brain and the mind are separate, but that's another discussion. You do science with your brain. Give me the short history of the brain. And they come up with something like this. Well, the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And I look at them and smile and I say, and you trust it? I said, tell me honestly, if you knew that the computer that you use every day for doing your science was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? Now, here's the interesting thing. I have always got the answer no. And I say to them, you have a problem, don't you? Because you are giving me an explanation of your brain mind that you wouldn't accept in any other area. Atheism gives you no ground for trusting the rationality you need to do science. So what atheism does is not only shoot you in the foot, and that's painful, it shoots you in the head, and that's fatal.
It's new to the scientific community to be really seriously considering the God hypothesis. And your work is specifically in this area of intelligent design. For those who aren't familiar with it, can you just give us a summary? What is intelligent design?
Well, intelligent design is the idea or the theory that there are certain features of life and the universe that are best explained by a designing intelligence rather than by an undirected, unguided mechanism, such as, for example, natural selection acting on random mutation. Or you could say even more succinctly that intelligent design is the idea that you can detect the activity of an intelligence from the features of life in the universe that we see around us.
So is going the route of intelligent design to end up with a God hypothesis, is that really necessary when we have something like the revelation of God in Scripture? Why not just assert that God exists based on the authority of Scripture rather than what appears to be backing into that truth by way of evidence?
For a number of reasons. One, we're a group of scientists and that we're interested in what the science can tell us about the origin of the universe and the origin of life. So we're looking at the scientific evidence and we want to come up with the best explanation or the best theory about how things came to be. And when we find things like the digital code that's stored in the DNA molecule or the tiny miniature nanomachines, the rotary engines and sliding clamps and little turbines and things that we find in cells, we want to explain where they came from. And as we examine what we know about undirected material processes, undirected chemical interactions, if we're talking about the origin of the first life, turns out that those undirected processes simply don't have the creative power to generate the types of features that we're seeing in living organisms. Bill Gates, for example, has said that the DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever created. And we know from our uniform and repeated experience, which is the basis of all scientific reasoning, that software comes from a mind, from a programmer. So the best explanation of what we're looking at when we see the digital code stored in the DNA is by using standard methods of scientific reasoning, the activity of a designing intelligence. And that's just so we're just wanting in that sense just to do good science, to follow the evidence where it leads in accord with our standard methods of scientific reasoning. But from the standpoint of Christian faith, if you're wanting to persuade someone of the existence of God and they don't already presume the reliability of the Bible, you can't appeal to biblical authority to persuade them. You have to appeal to them on the basis of something you have in common, a common ground premise. And scientific evidence actually provides that. Many people in the culture accept that science is a good way to know things and that there's the evidence that we're looking at, whether it's the digital code in DNA or the miniature machines I was talking about, or what physicists are talking about when they talk about the fine-tuning of the physical parameters of the universe, or the discovery that the universe itself has a beginning, just as the book of Genesis affirmed. All of those discoveries are in the realm of science that pretty much everyone accepts, and so that provides a common ground for reasoning about how best to explain them.
Well, that makes perfect sense, and what you are explaining here is also affirmed in Scripture, and I think of Romans chapter 1, wherein we read that what can be known of God is obvious to men through the things that He's made. And that's what you're talking about, these little nano machines, these little rotary engines, these sliding clamps. How on earth do we explain this other than a God of immense power and intelligence and design? Dr. Meyer, intelligent design challenges the scientific orthodoxy that has been in place for so long. How have you found the response been to you asserting this God hypothesis in intelligent design?
Well, I might tease those two ideas apart first. The theory of intelligent design just affirms that there is an intelligence of some kind that best explains certain classes of evidence. And in my first two books, Signature in the Cell, and then a second book, Darwin's Doubt, I argued that the evidence that we have from biology, in particular about the bursts of information that come into our planet, into our biosphere, provide evidence of the activity of a designing agent. But many of my readers, after writing those first two books, wanted to know, well, who do you think the designing intelligence is, and what can science tell us about that question? So in the most recent book, Return of the God Hypothesis, I go beyond just the theory of intelligent design and reason carefully about what type of designer would best explain the evidence that we have at hand. And I expand the investigation from looking at just the evidence in biology, but also then I look at evidence from physics and cosmology about the origin of the universe and about what's called the fine-tuning of the physical parameters that have been in place since the very beginning of the universe. Some scientists had suggested that, yes, there is evidence of design in biology. Richard Dawkins, even in an interview with Ben Stein in a film back in 2008, allowed us how we might be looking at a signature of intelligence, is how he put it, when we look at the question of the origin of life. But then he posited that, well, if an intelligence had been involved, it must have evolved from through some undirected, explicable process on maybe some other planet, and then was seeded here on Earth. So that's sometimes other scientists, even Francis Crick, proposed that at one point. That's a hypothesis called panspermia, the space alien designer hypothesis. I've never been persuaded by that. It just doesn't kick the can down the road. It kicks the ultimate question of the origin of information out into space. But in the new book, I very carefully examined that hypothesis as well as other design hypotheses. For example, a deistic design hypothesis or a pantheistic version of design, and show that it's really classical theism with the idea of a transcendent intelligence that is also active in the creation that can explain the whole range of evidence we have. Some kind of intelligence is necessary to explain the information in biology, but only an intelligence that is in some way beyond the universe could explain the exquisite design of the universe itself in the fine-tuning of its laws and constants and initial conditions. And clearly, no space alien within the cosmos could explain the origin of the universe itself. Instead, that would also require an agent beyond the universe to bring the universe into existence. If you posit an immaterial agency with great power, separate from the universe, then you're able to explain how the physical universe of matter, space, time, and energy came into existence. We now have very good evidence that the physical universe did come into existence a finite time ago. And that means that before that, there was no matter to do the causing. So no materialistic explanation is going to be sufficient for the origin of the material universe. You need to look for something immaterial that's nevertheless powerful. And that's the God hypothesis.
And we need to be thinking in this way because we get asked questions from critics like, well, if you're saying that everything has a beginning and an end, or if every created thing is created, well, then who created God? If God is here, then what was his beginning? And we have to understand that that's sort of a category mistake, right? We're talking about the uncaused cause. We're talking about the God that exists outside of the universe, as you're saying, time and space, who can actually create these dimensions and these things.
Well, yeah, it's a question of what provides an adequate explanation of the evidence that we have at hand. Every philosophical system, every worldview has to propose what philosophers sometimes call the prime reality or a primitive, the thing from which everything else comes. In materialism, it's matter and energy that are thought to be eternal and self-existent and do not require anything else to create them. In theism, theists affirm that God is the eternal self-existent thing. So the question philosophically is which of those two systems of thought is more consistent with the evidence we have. Now that we have good evidence that the material universe itself had a beginning a finite time ago, we can no longer affirm that matter and energy have existed eternally into the past. They had a beginning point. And that makes matter and energy a poor candidate to be that prime reality, the thing from which everything else comes. And instead, if you want to provide an adequate explanation for the origin of the material universe, you need to posit something that's external to that universe. And for that and other reasons, the God hypothesis provides a better explanation of the evidence that we have.
Dr. Meyer, your work in The Return of the God Hypothesis and other intelligent design books is so compelling. At least it is to me and to so many others, yet you still have critics. What do your critics say about your work, and how do you respond to them?
Well, typically the thing we hear is not that there is no evidence for intelligent design, but rather that the theory is not scientific, that it doesn't qualify as a scientific theory because it posits, for example, an unobservable designing intelligence. But that's not really a statement about whether or not the theory is true. It's a statement about whether it qualifies as a certain kind of inquiry, namely scientific inquiry. And it turns out that as I've developed the case for intelligent design, I've used the exact same method of reasoning that Charles Darwin used in The Origin of Species. It's a distinctively historical method where you infer a past unobservable state or action in order to explain the evidence that we have at hand. And in fact, there are many unobservable entities that are part of Darwin's theory, unobservable past alleged transitional intermediate species or forms of life, past unobservable mutational events. And many other branches of science also invoke unobservable entities. Theoretical physics, for example, invokes the existence of unobservable elementary particles or fields. But these things are known. We affirm them because if they exist, they can help us explain things that we can see. And so it turns out that if you want to say intelligent design is unscientific or not scientific because it posits a past unobservable entity, you would have to say the same of a lot of other branches of science, including evolutionary biology itself. So there's a kind of a double standard at work in this objection. Whatever intelligent design is, I think it's a historical scientific theory that has larger metaphysical implications. I think we can say the exact same thing of Darwinism. It's an historical scientific theory that has larger metaphysical implications. The two things aren't different types of inquiries or different types of things. They're two different answers to the very same question. How did life arise on planet Earth?
Well, that makes so much sense. And it sounds to me like people who are trying to just find any loophole to get around the answer that seems to be so obvious. I think of forensics. I think of basic things that we can't prove with the historical method because we can't observe those things today. Was Nero really in charge of Rome? Well, we can't go back and find that out through the scientific method, but we can use other things to demonstrate that that's the most reasonable explanation for all the evidence that we find.
Yeah, that's a well-chosen phrase because the method that is used in the historical sciences is sometimes called the method of inference to the best explanation. There are good historical explanations and there are bad historical explanations, and it really depends on how well they are able to account for the data that we have that's left over from the past. And let me give you another example that illustrates why this objection, intelligent design isn't science, is really missing the point. If I walked into the British Museum, or if your viewers walk in and they encounter that beautiful display with the Rosetta Stone, and looked at it for a few minutes, they'd very quickly realize that they were looking at an artifact that had been produced by an intelligent agent, because there before us lies 3 different sets of inscriptions, and they're obviously linguistic. And when the scientists cracked the different codes and understood that they had the same message written in 3 different languages, they realized that there must have been intelligent scribes behind that artifact. It wasn't something that was produced by wind and erosion. But they didn't violate any laws of reasoning or laws of science to do that. They were just using good thinking to infer the best explanation. And when people insist that to be a scientist, you must limit yourself to strictly materialistic explanations, well, there are actually many, many branches of science that already don't do that because they are encountering evidence that is best explained by the activity of an intelligence. So we think that the best approach when we're looking at the origin of life or similar questions is to follow the evidence where it most naturally leads and posit the explanation that, based on our uniform and repeated experience, is best capable of explaining the evidence that we have at hand. And if you have information, the best explanation is a mind. Whenever we see information, whether it's in a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book or in a section of software in a computer or if it's embedded in a radio signal, whenever we see information and trace it back to its ultimate source, we always come to a mind, not a material process. That's what we know from our experience. And therefore, when we find information embedded in even the simplest living cells in the DNA molecule, the best explanation is, again, the activity of a prior designing intelligence. And we shouldn't let our definitions of science prevent us from seeing that reality.
Boy, the more that you talk, it becomes clearer and clearer. Even with a simple example of, I look at a painting of the Mona Lisa, what evidence do I have that there was ever a painter? Well, I would have to have had a lobotomy to think that paintings like that just paint themselves, or perhaps I would have an ulterior motive, and then go to a real living, breathing human being, and then to say that there wasn't a designer behind that is even more preposterous in my estimation.
Well, that's the thing that's so magnificent in our modern era, this contemporary period in biology, is that it isn't just that we have digital code in cells. It's that the digital code stored in the DNA is part of an intricate information storage, transmission, and processing system. And the processing of that information is accomplished by exquisite nanomachines. And so you've got miniature machinery, you've got digital code, you've got an information processing system. There's a kind of circuitry that's involved in coordinating the the expression of genetic information during animal development. The complexity of living systems is absolutely mind-boggling, but it's not complexity in the sense of a random array of junk. It's an integrated and functional complexity that's absolutely necessary to sustaining life. And so we're in a new day in biology. When Darwin was writing in 1859, one of his contemporaries, Thomas Henry Huxley, described the cell as a simple homogeneous globule of undifferentiated protoplasm. The idea was it was just a bunch of simple jello or goo. Well, when that's what we thought life was made of, it was easy to imagine that a few simple chemical reactions could have produced it. But now when we see that life is complex on the order of a factory run by digital code, like one of our modern CAD/CAM systems and beyond, the idea that undirected chemistry could produce the first life is implausible in the extreme. So, and instead, what we're seeing in every realm of biology are hallmarks or distinctive features of life that in all other realms of experience also indicate the activity of a designing intelligence. When you see circuitry, you know that there was an engineer involved. When you see machinery, rotary engines, for example, you know there must have been an engineer. When you see digital code, you know there must have been a programmer. So the 19th century view of life, I think, is no longer plausible.